I'll just say two lines about you, and like Bongbin, perhaps you can speak about yourself much more eloquently. But Sue says will present her lived experience learning about health, education, and finance within private, state, and community contexts. And this includes within UK, Scandinavia, Europe, and North Africa.
Thank you very much. So you get me in person. I have 20 minutes, and what I'm going to do is to share my lived experience. Basically, my influence is because of my interest in health, in learning, and also in finance. What we're looking at, first of all, and let me get my clicker, is about exchange and trade. One of the things I found really valuable to be invited here today, thank you very much, is my memory of monetary reform in the 90s, where what I found is that everybody had the solution. The difficulty was that the solutions were different. And what happened is they used to argue amongst themselves about which was the right solution, which meant that the finance didn't bother in anything that we're trying to do with monetary reform. I'm heartened by what you've said and moved by it, that we're actually joining together and collaborating in a way in which we go forward. That's really helpful to see. Thank you. So let's have a look, first of all, at Brixton Local Exchange and Trade Scheme, which I was involved with in the 90s, early noughties. And the system was basically a zero account system. And the units that we used were actually called bricks. And that might have been because one of the co-founders was actually an architect. I don't know, but it linked. One of the things, so I'm going to look at a couple of elements. One of the things that I noticed in going through with it is people who over-earned were valued. People who overspent were chastised. The reality is that overspenders and over-earners were damaging to a zero-based account because nothing could move. And there was no point in it. It didn't create any value. It just created promises. And unless you used promises and actually spent promises, it actually didn't help the basics. I was fascinated with how people were talked to, thought of, spoken about, talked with, dealt with in that environment, and that the reality which we had learnt early on in our lives meant that actually exchanging and trading wasn't as helpful, particularly when we brought in businesses as well. And they used to treat us like, I remember one electrician who could never turn up on time, never turn up in the day, because of course it was just bricks that he was collating. So I'm fascinated with how we relate to this. The earning versus the spending. The thing that I found really helpful was when babysitters were connected. Of course, babysitters got paid more bricks than someone training you on a computer. And whenever people were saying, when I said, what are you offering? They always are looking at what we were offering, or they were offering with sterling, with money, with bank money. We had several conversations to kind of flow with a different kind of offering. But what I found was that babysitters, once they connected, they didn't bother with the accounting system. What they did was they exchanged and worked out their own value system. They probably didn't talk about bricks. They might have talked about time, because in a way, babysitting was seen as relatively equal in terms of time. So we lost them. However, they wouldn't have connected if it hadn't been for Brixton Lex. So I was fascinated with how people related to it. And notice with the babysitting, it's very similar, like Patna and other kinds of systems, which were always quite quiet. And I think that was probably a very healthy way of dealing with it, because in Liverpool, if you signed up to a local exchange and trade scheme, you got removed from the welfare benefit system. Your credits were removed because you were dealing in the black economy. This is in the 90s. So let's take it on then, looking at the Brixton pound, which kind of grew into the town pound. I was invited in 2007, I think, to join the local economy group of Brixton Transition. And we did a force field analysis about how we would bring in a different system. It was run by leaders and also quite a few egos from Transition Town and also from the New Economics Foundation. But we decided that we needed to link it with sterling. That had huge consequences. It went very well, and I've got some Brixton pounds here that you can have a look at, that were beautifully designed. And we decided after 2 years, if you didn't exchange it back for sterling, then you lost it. These notes went literally all over the world. And so what happened is I actually had the bank account that we opened where you could exchange. We'd actually printed £40,000 worth equivalent. So at the end of 2 years, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, if we have that money left in that account, what will HMRC say to us? So we explored a little bit and then gave that information to the Bristol pound, who then had a meeting with HMRC and the Treasury, and they said, as long as you don't call it money, we're not coming after you. But it was really fascinating learning. And I'm amazed. Can you just back all that for me a minute? What people project onto these bits of paper, it's absolutely astounding. And of course they don't want us to use this anymore, cash, because it's in our pocket. It feels like it belongs to us. We don't have money. What we have is numbers in bank accounts, if we're allowed a bank account. And of course, there are lots of restrictions. We need to rethink what it is that we're actually talking and living with. So what I'm looking at from there is the relationships and the people and how we are with it. Now, what happens is, we've learnt is that as children, we learn to collaborate. And this has been seen in psychological and learning terms. It's seen. What we do is we then go to school. And what school says, get top marks. And if you can't get top marks, make sure you know how to kick the football so you get most goals. So what we're taught, and it goes in, and I'll explain to you about the wiring. It goes in, we're taught to compete, not collaborate. Now, we come in with our brain, particularly in the front, mostly empty. Way we wire that is with our relationships with people around us, seeing our culture. Our culture is wired into our system. Now, we know in this environment, when something is wired in, and you suddenly say, oh no, I don't want it there, I want it over here. What do you have to do and get it rewired? Is you have to take apart some of the structure and then create new wiring. We have to do that as well. So if we have learnt, and our primary learning is the most powerful, it never goes away. We can add on to it, but it's most powerful. We've learnt to compete rather than collaborate. And the thing that is most helpful in this kind of thing in the wiring is how we're going to collaborate. So I've forgotten the next slide. Basically, it's looking at our relations and also our financial systems. And I'm trying not to go over time. Thank you. Thank you very much. So what I'm looking at is people and how we relate with each other is key. And what I know is, from this book, Invisible Loyalties, is that our wiring in the back of our brain, in the base of our brain, we come through with an accounting system. We know if we do something for someone, we usually expect something back in some kind of a way. And if you don't know that, if you've seen kids, young kids, the way they are with each other or where they share or where they don't, that kind of thing. So we have invisible loyalties, we have built-in accounting systems. But what happens is that gets rejigged in the way in which we're wired together. And increasingly, we're learning from polyvagal theory where that wiring works for us in a variety of different ways. And we need to look at the perspective. This, of course, at the moment, the guy, Stephen Porges, wrote it as an academic and documented it as an academic. Then he realized he needed to communicate it to us. Documented academia didn't mean anything to us. And of course, it was linked to clinical psychology. So it was linked to things like trauma, etc. But what would be really helpful is we began to look at this in relationship to how we exchange and trade with each other, how we use these promises in a variety of different formats in order to be able to do that. So let's have a look then finally at where the possibilities are. We have the Festival of Commoning, which is happening in Stroud in September, the second one. And we're looking at lots of varieties. I've got on the next slide, I've got the website that you could look at. We've got an enormous number of commons groups around, but not necessarily connected, which is partly why we wanted the Festival of Commoning, in order to create some of those connections. And then we've got the Credit Commons Society, which started probably in 2020 in lockdown and therefore online, which is really interesting, but at the moment doesn't know what it is or what it's going to do or who's going to do it or how it's going to happen. So if anyone's interested, please join and help us find out what we're going to do. And then we've got a variety of circular trade. One of them that I know about is Local Loop in Merseyside, where local businesses who trade with each other put their invoices in at the end of the month, and they cancel out. So someone has spent something, £1,000 with one, and the other person spent 600. They don't need to use bank money other than the 400. So they sort it, and they learnt it from, and I can never remember if it's Slovenia or Slovakia, after Russia, they started to do that themselves because all the invoices from businesses went to government. And so the government sorted that out and therefore only used certain amounts of bank money. And that was really valuable because there wasn't a problem at the end of months of people that didn't get paid. So they're exploring that in Merseyside at the moment. And another person who I think might be interesting, who actually, Fred Harrison, who predicted the collapse financially in 1970s, also in the 1990s, and also in 2007 and 8. And no one listened to him. He even spent 10 years in Russia trying to persuade them, after they had changed their systems, to begin to look at how you created a viable and just economy. His book he wrote, The Traumatized Society, which brings in an idea. Thanks. I'll leave them here for people can come and look at them. Which brings in the idea of, in this book, how people are traumatized in relationship to money and economies. He's in the process of writing a book, and he's at the School of Philosophy and Economic Science, which isn't far from here. He's now looking at what he says, which is what Bronwyn was saying: who's going to solve this problem? Us. He's looking at how do we, in commons, and this moves me, how do we solve our problem with ourselves, for ourselves, in a way that's going to promote it going forward? Thank you for listening.